So welcome back. Our next presentation on the Free From and Allergy virtual show is on food chemicals or FODMAPs. What's your IBS trigger? So research indicates that 50 to 80% of people do get an improvement on the low FODMAP diet. But what happens if you're one of the 20 to 50% that don't? So food chemicals are different from FODMAPs. They occur naturally in many foods or can be added in food processing. For some people, these can trigger IBS symptoms. So working with Joanna Baker today, we're going to learn about the differences between FODMAPs and food chemicals and how to determine which approach is best for you. Now, Joanna Baker is a dietitian and she loves food. Her passion for digestive health comes from her own battle with IBS. So she consults virtually via Everyday Nutrition and loves working with people around Australia and throughout the world, helping them to identify their triggers and to learn to love food again. So please welcome Joanna Baker.
Thank you, Mary, for that lovely introduction. I'm really excited to be here today. This is a topic that's really close to my heart. So today we're going to talk about FODMAPs and food chemicals, what's similar, what's different, and how to sort of differentiate between the two. So we'll go to the next slide. So just guessing, whoever said trust your gut did not have IBS. I think one of the hardest things about IBS is living with the unpredictability of it. While I can't take away somebody's IBS, what I can do is help somebody learn to manage it, help you work out what your triggers are and remove that unpredictability so that you can learn to trust your gut again and so that you're in control of your life rather than your gut being in control of you. Next slide. So as Mari said, we know that around 50 to 80% of people, or the number most commonly quoted is 3 out of 4 people will get a significant improvement in their symptoms with a low FODMAP diet. But what I tend to find is that a lot of the time that 1 out of 4 people are the ones that end up in my clinic because the FODMAP diet's not working. So I'm spending a lot of time working with these people on troubleshooting and working out what their triggers are. Jared, next slide. So my name's Joanna Baker. As Mari said, I'm a dietitian and I'm a registered nurse. I've had IBS for longer than I can remember. I think I was only 12 months old the first time my mother took me to the doctor saying that there was something wrong with my gut. So I don't really know life any other way, and that's where a lot of my passion comes from. I spent the first half of my working career working as a nurse in operating theatres. So that gave me a really good understanding of the human body and all that biochemistry and all that stuff that goes on inside. And then after my son was born, I went back to university and retrained to do a master's of dietetics where I became an accredited practicing dietitian. Since graduating, I wanted to get out of the hospital system. I wanted to get into the community and work more on prevention rather than cure. So I jumped straight into the community. My passion was for digestive health. So I started working with people who had IBS, with low FODMAPs, and with other types of food intolerances. Over the last 5 years, I've written for FODMAP magazine. I've written for Australian Gluten-Free Life, Healthy Food Guide. I've also presented on the low FODMAP diet and on food chemicals around Australia, Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, and also in 2017 in the USA, in Chicago and Dallas, I presented on FODMAPs as well. I'm on the advisory board for the Master of Dietetics at Deakin University here in Melbourne, and I'm also on the Food Allergy and Intolerance Interest Group board with the Dietitians Australia. I also work in the food industry. I've worked with FODMAP Friendly in the past. I've worked with FODMAP For You and a few other food manufacturers to help with the development of low FODMAP products and FODMAP testing as well. So we'll go next slide. So I want to start off by introducing you to Lisa. So Lisa is probably characteristic of a lot of the people that I see. When she first came to me, She was experiencing bloating and a burning in her digestive tract, which she rated at around 7 out of 10 severity on any given day. She was having constipation. She was going to the toilet maybe twice a week. And even when she did go, it was small, it was hard, it was difficult to pass. And she was often taking something like Movicol to get things moving. On top of these digestive problems, she also had skin rashes. So she was getting flares of eczema, which she was pretty sure was related to the food that she was eating because she'd noticed differences depending on her diet. And she was also experiencing severe fatigue and lethargy. And she noticed that this often preceded severe sinus congestion. So she was starting to question if sinuses and lethargy were also related to her food sensitivities. In terms of medical history, Lisa was fit and healthy. She'd seen her gastroenterologist, she'd had top and tail scopes, she'd had all the blood tests under the sun, and all the doctors kept saying to her, Lisa, there's nothing wrong with you. We can't find anything wrong. You're fit and healthy. Lisa also knew that her father and her grandmother also have IBS. And over the last 2 years, she'd been following the low FODMAP diet, and she'd also dabbled a little bit with gluten-free. And this had given her approximately a 50% improvement, but she was still getting these flares of symptoms every so often. She didn't know what was causing them, why it was happening, and she hadn't been able to reintroduce any of those higher FODMAP foods. Next slide. So as you can see here, I've just got a nice little picture here of Lisa's leg, and this is just an example of the rash that she was experiencing it during the time, and this rash was literally all over her body. So first of all, I want to talk about what is IBS. So IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome, it's a chronic functional condition. And what this means is that the body is essentially medically healthy. There is no damage, there is nothing that needs healing, but the bowel and the gut are not functioning the way that they should. We don't know what causes IBS. We know that there are lots of things that contribute to flares and triggers with IBS, but we don't have an underlying cause for it. We also know that IBS doesn't cause damage to the body on the plus side as well, which is really great. But what that means is that our goal of managing IBS is first of all to identify the triggers, to manage the symptoms and improve quality of life. When we want to diagnose IBS, the very first thing we need to do is exclude medical conditions. So there are some other conditions, things like celiac disease and inflammatory bowel diseases, and their symptoms can mimic IBS. So we actually want to know that those don't exist first of all. We want to investigate if there are any red flags, and that might be things like unexplained weight loss, there might be blood in the stool, there might be a family history of things like bowel cancers or bowel diseases that we need to exclude. If all that has been excluded, so like in Lisa's case, the doctor comes back and says, well, you're medically healthy, we don't know, we don't have a cause for these symptoms. The next thing we would do to diagnose IBS is compare your symptoms to the Rome 4 criteria. So what this criteria does is it looks at your group of symptoms and it says, does this fit the IBS picture? And what that means is that someone must have had pain on average of about 1 day per week or more, and it needs to be going on for some time. So this isn't just a one-off thing, it's been happening for a while, 3 months or more. We also like this pain to be related to one of 3 criteria. So that might be, the pain might be related to having a bowel movement, it might be associated with a change in frequency, or it might be associated with a change in appearance of stool form. So the stool might be looser or firmer than what would be considered normal. And if you fit that criteria and you've had medical conditions excluded, you can then assume that you can then be diagnosed with IBS. Next slide. So a few little facts about IBS. Like I said, we don't know what causes IBS, and for that reason, we can't actually cure IBS. We can't say, oh, this is wrong, we need to do this, and then it will go away. But we also know that IBS does not damage the body, and our goal of managing it is to improve symptoms and improve quality of life so that you can get your life back and get back in control. IBS is super common. About 1 in 7 people, or 15% of the population, will experience irritable bowel syndrome at some point. It's the most common reason that someone will visit a gastroenterologist. It's the most common reason that somebody will take time off work. We know that about 2/3 of people or 3/4 of people around about are female, and we think that there's some hormonal reasons going on there as well. Next slide. When we're looking at what our triggers for IBS are, there are a few things that we know about. So we know that there's food intolerances like FODMAPs, food chemicals or whole food sensitivities that can trigger IBS, gut irritants, things like alcohol, caffeine, fiber, high fat meals. We know these can irritate the gut. Meal size and eating patterns does have an impact on IBS symptoms as well. We know people with a sensitive gut do better with smaller, more regular meals. Hormones, like I said, medications, pelvic floor can have a big impact on IBS. And then, of course, we've got the gut-brain axis and that visceral hypersensitivity that we know has a big impact. And that brings in where that sort of stress and that emotional well-being comes into the IBS picture as well. So today I'm going to be focusing mostly on food sensitivities. And so first of all, we've got FODMAPs. These are specific types of carbohydrates. They're not well absorbed. They literally go, that when we eat food that contains them, they go in one end, they travel through the digestive tract and they come out the other end. On the way through, they can cause digestive problems. We've also got food chemicals. Now, when I use the word food chemicals, I'm not talking about the artificial ones that are added. These can be naturally occurring. So they occur naturally in a variety of different fruits, vegetables, meats, cheeses, and different foods. And we know that when we all eat them, and they all go down into our stomach and then get absorbed into our bloodstream along with all the other vitamins and minerals and carbs and proteins that we eat. If someone is sensitive to them and you have a large amount of them in your system, and you go over your threshold, this will cause a histamine type response. And this can cause gut symptoms, skin symptoms, sinus symptoms, and neurological symptoms. We've also got whole food intolerances. We don't have a really good understanding of why and how these cause symptoms, but we definitely know that there are some people out there in the population that are sensitive to the different proteins, perhaps in wheat or dairy, soy, and egg. These are the four most common, but there are other random ones as well. And I kind of feel like the longer I'm in this game, the more I realize there are things that science just doesn't know yet about food sensitivities. So what are FODMAPs? Like I said, they're types of carbohydrates. When we eat foods that contain FODMAPs, they go in through the mouth into the stomach. The stomach is essentially a giant blender. It blends everything up into a smoothie and then releases it into the small intestine. The small intestine there, that's where our body will extract all the nutrients, so the vitamins, the minerals, the energy from our food, and absorb it into the body. What does not get absorbed is left over. It stays in the digestive tract, it moves down into the colon and comes out the other end. FODMAPs are some of those molecules that do not get absorbed for one reason or another. And as they pass through, they do two things. So FODMAPs are really osmotic. As they move through the digestive tract, they attract water into the digestive tract. They fill the bowel up with water. That makes people feel bloated. It causes loose or watery stools. The other thing that happens with FODMAPs is when they're in the colon, that very last part of the digestive tract, they get fermented. That fermentation creates gas, and the gas will stretch the walls of the intestines. It'll make you feel bloated. It'll make you windy, and it'll irritate those nerve endings and make things really uncomfortable. Next slide, please. So where are FODMAPs found? FODMAP's an acronym. There are actually 4 different types of FODMAPs. The F stands for fermentable because these are products that are fermented in the digestive tract. The oligosaccharides, these are found in wheat, barley, rye, onions and garlics, legumes, all of those traditional windy type foods. The disaccharides, that's referring to lactose, which is the milk, which is the sugar or carbohydrate molecule that's found in milk and milk products. The monosaccharides is fructose, and fructose is only a FODMAPs when it's present in excess of glucose. So it's that excess fructose that we're mostly concerned about. Finally, polyols, the P of the FODMAP acronym, sorbitol and mannitol. These are sugar alcohols. They're not like the alcohol you drink. and alcohol, because of the structure of the sugar molecule. We find these commonly in things like apples, pears, stone fruits, cauliflower, mushrooms, and we also see these used as artificial sweeteners. So we might see them in things like your sugar-free chewing gums and things like that. Next slide. So food chemicals, these are different from FODMAPs. They occur naturally, or they can be artificially added to foods and drinks. So we have salicylates, amines, and glutamates, which are 3 naturally occurring food chemicals. We then have a little group of artificially added preservatives, additives, colors, and flavor enhancers that also fall under that food chemical umbrella as well. The thing with food chemicals is that when we eat foods that contain them, or if we inhale perfumes that contain food chemicals, they get absorbed into the bloodstream. As that level builds up, if you go over your threshold, they cause a generalized nerve irritation. And the centre that does most of the research into food chemicals is Royal Prince Alfred Hospital Allergy Unit in Sydney, and that's where most of my information comes from, and I use them mostly as a resource for investigating these intolerances as well. So the types of symptoms, like I said, these are inside your bloodstream, so we can see a lot more systemic symptoms. The symptoms can vary from person to person. You may have 1, or you may have 2 or 3, or even all 4 body systems affected by food chemicals. There's skin reactions like rashes, hives, and eczema are super common. We see gastrointestinal symptoms, so those classic IBS type symptoms with the bloating, the pain, constipation, or diarrhea. We see respiratory symptoms, things like sinus congestion or throat irritation. One of the common things I hear people complaining about is having an unusual taste in their mouth, or feeling like they've got difficulty swallowing, like there's something stuck in their throat. And we also see these neurological symptoms. It might be things like headaches and migraines. In children, we might see behavioral problems, disruptive behavior. And we also get a lot of, I hear people describe it as a hangover type feeling, where they're feeling lethargic and exhausted and tired all the time. We know that these food chemicals do not, even though they cause symptoms and they do affect quality of life, they can be quite debilitating in that sense, but they don't cause physical damage to the body. So again, it's like standard for IBS is our goal is to work out, do these trigger you or not? If they do, which ones trigger you? And how can we modify your diet to get you maximum variety with minimum symptoms and improve that quality of life, to put you back in charge again? So where are food chemicals found? Well, we've got salicylates, and salicylates are a plant chemical. They're actually a natural antibacterial or preservative type agent that is designed to make life or living beings feel unwell. So a plant will produce salicylates, it will put it into the skins of the fruits and vegetables, and when the bug comes along and takes a bite, the salicylate in the plant will make that bug feel sick or unwell, so that it leaves the plant alone and the plant has protected itself. We know that some people are sensitive to these as well, and will also feel sick or unwell when they eat foods, a lot of foods that contain salicylates. We find them in fruits, vegetables, tea, coffee, herbs and spices, honey, fruit juices, beers, wines. The mint in your toothpaste is a salicylate, and aspirin itself is also made of salicylic acid. We've also got amines. Amines are related to the age or the fermentation of a product. So as fruits and vegetables ripen, or as meats and cheeses age, the proteins break down and they start to release amines. These amines, they're almost like natural flavor enhancers. We see them in overripe fruits and vegetables. We see them in aged meat. We see them in aged cheeses, or those gooey things like the camemberts, the bries, the parmesans with lots of flavor in them. We see them in sauces, in marinades. Chocolate in particular is very high in amines. And of course, fermented products, things like sauerkraut and kimchi, pickles. Those fermented things are going to be quite high in amines as well. Glutamates, these are the ones that cross over. So we see glutamates naturally out in nature. And when glutamates are out in nature, we only ever see them with amines. We seldom see glutamates on their own in nature. But glutamates as well, these are flavor enhancers. And the way they enhance flavor is by stimulating the nerve endings in the taste buds. So they essentially wake up the taste buds and stimulate them so that you can taste the flavor more strongly. People that are sensitive to glutamates, obviously the other nerve endings in their body get stimulated as well by them. But because we know these are quite good at stimulating taste buds, we've actually extracted glutamate from seaweed and we now use it as a flavor enhancer. And most of you would have heard it referred to as MSG, as a flavor enhancer used in food processing and snacks and savory type products. We've also got another little group of additives and preservatives which you may or may not have paid any attention to, but things like sorbates, propionates, sulfites are probably a more well-known one. Nitrates are fairly well-known as well. And these fall under the food chemical umbrella as well because they work in a similar way. So when we're looking at foods and we're comparing FODMAPs and food chemicals, as you can see, there are some differences and some similarities. And we see about a 50% crossover in terms of the foods that contain FODMAPs and food chemicals. So on one side of the screen here, we've got things like wheat, garlic, leek, which are all high FODMAP, but low on food chemicals. And on the other side, we've got things like strawberries, capsicum, aged meats, canned tunas, aged cheeses, which we know are low on FODMAPs, but these are super high in food chemicals. And in the middle, we've got foods that cross over. So if you were to go on a low FODMAP diet, you're going to lower your load of food chemicals. So even if you're sensitive to food chemicals, you can get an improvement in your symptoms on a low FODMAP diet because you're also removing things like onion, cauliflower, avocado, honey, sauerkraut, and they're high on both FODMAPs and food chemicals. With both FODMAPs and food chemicals, these are dose dependent and related to threshold. The thing I like to point out about threshold is that threshold is not fixed. So there will be some times in your life where your threshold is lower and you might quite easily go over your threshold and cause symptoms. And there may be other times in your life that your threshold is a lot higher and it takes a lot more of a food to reach your threshold and cause symptoms. We also know, so this can happen in one meal, but it can also happen as a build-up as well. Next. So when we put them side by side, FODMAPs and food chemicals, they're both dose dependent and related to threshold. They both do not cause damage, but do cause symptoms, and it can be debilitating to quality of life. FODMAPs do not have withdrawal symptoms, but with food chemicals, they're inside your bloodstream. It can take time to flush them out, and sometimes we see withdrawal symptoms. The most well-known thing we've seen is caffeine is another type of food chemical, and we all know that if you suddenly stop having coffee, some people will complain of getting those caffeine withdrawal headaches. That's common to other food chemicals as well. Perfumes and soaps, these are a food chemical thing. They're not a FODMAP thing. When we look at the symptoms, gut symptoms are common to both FODMAPs and food chemicals. Skin symptoms, these are a food chemical thing. FODMAPs do not enter the body, they don't access the skin, they don't cause rashes or hives or eczema. The central nervous system or the neurological symptoms, we know that food chemicals themselves can cause fatigue, headaches, anxiety, but we also know that living with IBS symptoms can cause that anxiety and fatigue and exhaustion as well. So the way I see it, the neurological symptoms can cross over. Airway symptoms, again, we don't see FODMAPs causing problems with sinus congestion, but we do see this with food chemicals. And when we're looking at symptom onset, FODMAPs cause problems as they pass through the large intestine. So it takes about 4 to 6 hours for a food to reach the large intestine. And by about 24 hours, most of the time, 24 to 48, it would have passed through already. So that's our time frame for FODMAPs. Food chemicals, they're in your bloodstream. They can build up over hours or days, and we can actually see symptoms occur anything from a shorter hour, half an hour time frame, or even up to a build up over several days. When it comes to testing techniques, neither FODMAPs or food chemicals cause damage to the body. So we can do blood tests, we can do scopes, we can do scans, we can do all sorts of things, and we will not see the impact of food chemicals or FODMAPs on the body. Both of them cause symptoms, disrupt quality of life. But what this means is that it's kind of a double-edged sword. We can't do a blood test to test for these things, or a hair test or skin test. They don't tell us anything about sensitivity. But at the same time, if someone is sensitive, they don't have to be strictly avoided because they're not going to put you in hospital in the long term. They're not going to cause more serious conditions. It's purely about managing those symptoms. In terms of identifying if you're sensitive, the Australasian Society of Clinical Immunology and Allergy, or ASCIA as I like to call them, their recommendation is first you see your doctor and get a diagnosis. You work out, are your symptoms actually, do they have an underlying medical cause or not? If they do have an underlying medical cause, obviously that needs to be fixed. If they don't, then we're working with lifestyle and diet. The next thing you want to do is if diet is determined at playing a role in your symptoms, the next thing is to go and see a specialist dietitian who can actually help you work out what your individual triggers are and how much you need to avoid those to manage your quality of life. When it comes to, next slide please. When it comes to identifying food triggers, the gold standard is an elimination diet, where we put you on some sort of elimination diet for anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks. And FODMAP is the most well-known one, but there are other elimination diets as well, like the Royal Prince Alfred one, which I'm talking about today. And if you get, that's essentially that phase 1 is a trial to see if it gives an improvement in your symptoms. If it does give an improvement in your symptoms, we still don't know what was triggering you. So the next phase of this process is to do food challenges and work out, can we actually trigger symptoms? Because it's the ability to trigger a symptom that makes us confidently able to say, yes, this is your trigger. If we reintroduce a food and it doesn't cause any problems, then it's not one of your triggers. So that's a really important part. Once we know what you're sensitive to, we then move to a liberalization phase, where we want to reintroduce everything that you tolerate well. We want to manage a balance of your sensitivities, because we really want to give you maximum variety and minimum symptoms. As I said before, your threshold can move, and triggers and symptoms and sensitivity can change. So it's a really good idea to go back and re-challenge things later on in life as well. Next slide. So when I'm seeing someone for the first time and I'm trying to work out what is potentially triggering symptoms in them, firstly, I'm looking at their symptom profile. Are they getting just gut symptoms, or are they having a collection of these more systemic type skin, neurological, sinus type symptoms as well? What's their medical history like? Is there anything there going on? What have they tried in the past? What are the interventions that have worked? What has not worked? Do they have another explanation for perhaps why they might be getting some of these symptoms? Because these symptoms can be quite non-specific. They can be caused by food intolerance, but they can be caused by other factors as well. What does their current diet look like? What are they eating? Are they eating a lot of FODMAPs? Are they eating a lot of food chemicals? If someone's not eating any FODMAPs but experiencing symptoms, then I can almost exclude FODMAPs straight away as part of playing a role. If they're eating a lot of FODMAPs, then I've got to consider those as a potential trigger. I also want to know what their suspected triggers are as well, because that becomes part of the puzzle. So when I look at Lisa, I know that she's fit and healthy. She's not taking any medications. She has eczema, which she thinks is food related, and she has some mild stress, which she manages fairly well. She does meditation. She uses the Headspace app on most days to manage that, and it works really well. Socially, she's got a really supportive husband. She's got 2 grown children. They pretty much look after themselves these days, which is good. Lisa really loves shopping and cooking, which is great. I love it when I see that, because it shows a passion and an enjoyment of food. And we know that food isn't just about nutrition, it's about life as well and experiencing life. Lisa works part-time. In the past, she's tried low FODMAP and gluten-free, and that's improved her symptoms by about 50%. When we look at Lisa's symptom profile, she's got some of these FODMAP symptoms. The bloating, the pain and constipation fall very clearly as FODMAPs can do that, but she's also got food chemical symptoms there as well. So we know that food chemicals can also cause these gut symptoms that she's getting. She's got neurological symptoms. She gets migraines, she gets tiredness and lethargy, and she has a lot of these skin symptoms, the rashes and the hives. The sinus is not a big thing for her, so I haven't highlighted it, but it's an underlying thing that I've kind of got on my radar to see if we get a change with that. And this is Lisa's diet history. So when I look at what she's eating, I've gone through and I've highlighted all the foods that are high in food chemicals that she's eating. And I can see that she's eating food chemicals at every meal during the day. She's getting them in drinks as well, and she's getting them in terms of lots of fruits and vegetables there too. I can see that she's not eating any FODMAPs at all. I haven't been able to identify any FODMAPs that do them. I can see that she's limited FODMAP serve size. Next slide. When Lisa is suspicious of, the first thing she said to me is, everything I eat triggers symptoms. I don't understand. Sometimes I tolerate a food one week, but I don't tolerate it another week. It just doesn't make sense. She's suspicious of rice. This is kind of a random one. It doesn't fall under any umbrella. She's also suspicious of wheat and lactose, which these both can fall under the FODMAP umbrella. Bananas fall under both FODMAPs and food chemicals. She also identifies as coffee and rich and spicy foods, and even FODMAP certified foods, which shouldn't cause her problems, appear to cause problems in her. She suspects that she tolerates things like salad, kiwi fruit, broccoli, and green beans really well. But we've also got to assume that there may be some degree of misattribution going on here. Now, that's not to say that Lisa doesn't know her body. She's been living in her body for her whole life. So she knows her body really well. But at the same time, identifying a food sensitivity is tricky. We seldom eat one food on its own. We generally put a group of foods together to create a meal. We also know that symptoms can occur several days later. And I've also never had somebody that hasn't had at least one surprise when they're working through this process. So what do I see in Lisa? Next slide, please. There's no red flags. Her symptom profile, gut, skin, neurological symptoms, they're systemic. She's fit and healthy medically. FODMAP and gluten-free, 50% improvement. Her food diary tells me she's not eating any FODMAPs, she's gluten-free, she's eating a lot of food chemicals. Her diet's also limited, it's repetitive, and she's not meeting her nutritional needs for many, many reasons. Suspected triggers, FODMAPs and food chemicals. Next slide. So what I suggested to Lisa is that we've got a couple of options here. What we could do is we could first start by seeing if expanding her diet with perhaps some low FODMAP and low chemical foods to help her meet nutritional needs is the first step. That's probably my preferred option. That's my dietitian hat coming out. We have our next option is that we could do a low FODMAP and a low food chemical diet initially. So we bring that right back and remove everything and then slowly add things back in. And that's what I call a bottom-up approach. Or we could start by completing some FODMAP challenges, seeing if we can reintroduce some of these higher FODMAP but low chemical foods, and then start moving down. So a top-down approach is when we remove something to see if we get a result, and then we move down to the next thing, and we come back to we get to the same place eventually, whether we go bottom up or top down, but there's pros and cons of doing it both ways. So what Lisa decided to do, next slide please. So what Lisa decided she wanted to do is we wanted to treat her constipation directly. So we started out with 2 kiwi fruit a day and increasing her water. And we tried to expand her diet initially with some low FODMAP and low chemical foods. And the things I targeted there were things that were a good source of fiber that were going to give her a bit more stool bulk and perhaps help with some of that constipation. So I suggested oats initially. I also gave her some written information on food chemical intolerances that I wanted her to read over before our next meeting. When she came back to see me a month later, she had reintroduced oats and actually added back in lentils on her own. And she was tolerating both of these really, really well. Her stools were larger and softer, and she was going to the toilet every second day. So we'd already had an improvement in that. She'd had a read through that Royal Prince Alfred Hospital information and decided she wanted to look further into that. Her diet was still inadequate in many areas. So when we're implementing a low food chemical diet, there are a few ways we can do this. It's not like FODMAP where you get a list of yes and no's. With food chemicals, we tend to split foods into foods that are low in food chemicals, moderate, high, and very high. If we're going to do a simple or the least restrictive approach, we just remove the foods in that very high column. We can do a moderate approach where we remove the high and the very high, or we can do a strict approach where someone will only eat from the low column for the elimination period. After that, so first we need to decide which of those approaches we're doing, and then we ask ourselves, do we also need to be careful with FODMAPs? Do we also need to be gluten-free? Do we need to be dairy-free or soy-free as well in case something else is going on there? Next slide, please, Jared. The other thing that I also talked to Lisa about at this point was withdrawal symptoms, because we know that that can happen with food chemicals. It can take up to 2 weeks or more on a food chemical diet before people see a result, and people can get worse before they get better. And this is something that is specific to food chemicals. We don't see this with FODMAPs. FODMAPs go in one end, come out the other, and we usually see people getting better in a few days to a week. If someone's not better on a FODMAP diet by that 3 to 4 week mark, then it's time to troubleshoot with a specialist dietitian. Next slide. So Lisa decided to do the moderate food chemical approach. She was already gluten-free and wanted to stay that way. She had suspicions about dairy, so she decided to remove that. And she wasn't ready to start adding back in some of those low chemical but high FODMAP foods at that point. So we spent some time doing meal planning, label reading, working out what suitable products there were, what she was going to eat on this elimination diet. We also changed her soaps and shampoos because they can have perfumes in them that can trigger a food chemical sensitivity. My biggest concern about this is that this is extremely restrictive. I want to keep this elimination as short as possible. Obviously, that first 2 weeks, if she gets withdrawals, we have to write off anything that happens in that first 2 weeks. And what we're really interested in is week 3 and 4. So I'm looking at around about a 4-week elimination for this. I want to monitor her closely during this elimination. We want to take a multivitamin as well so that we cover our bases. Next slide. I then saw Lisa at her review a month later. She'd been on the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital moderate diet, plus low FODMAP and dairy-free for the last 4 weeks. She had started by eliminating gluten, but she actually ended up adding gluten wheat back in on her own during this time. But what she was excited to tell me is that she had never felt better in her life. Her gut symptoms had completely gone away. She was going to the toilet normally every single day. The rash had gone. Her energy levels have improved, and she didn't have a withdrawal flare. Now I've got another couple of photos here that Jared will just pop up. So the first one is that photo of Lisa's skin rash before the elimination diet. And the next photo, which was 4 weeks later, you can see that that completely cleared up and it had gone altogether. So we knew something that we had removed had made a big improvement for Lisa, but we didn't know what that was. Next slide, please. So this is when we got to our challenge phase. We decided that we wanted to challenge, we wanted to reintroduce things in a really systematic and structured way, one at a time, to see what triggered these symptoms to come back. I really emphasize here that the majority of people will get at least one surprise during this process. And the fact that we're combining FODMAPs and food chemicals means that we are limited with the foods that we can choose to challenge with, because we need to choose foods that only have one molecule in them at a time so that we know that molecule specifically. It also determines the order that we do challenges in. Next slide, please. Lisa came back to me after her challenges, and this is where we got at the end of the day. So we found out, first of all, that she tolerates oligosaccharides, fructose, and polyols. The only FODMAP that she was sensitive to, and remember this is even though she had a 50% improvement on a FODMAP diet, is lactose. In terms of food chemicals, she tolerates the salicylates really well. But we worked out that amines were actually a really big trigger for Lisa too. So amines and lactose were Lisa's 2 main triggers. So next slide, please. What we did then is that we reintroduced all of the foods that Lisa tolerated well, and we did a slow liberalization of the amines to work out how to balance those, and we decided that we were going to limit lactose most of the time. When I saw Lisa a year later, she had no burning, she had no constipation, she had no skin rashes. Her diet was wide and varied, and she was so excited to tell me that she was loving going out to dinner and spending time with friends and family and traveling. She is tolerating small serves of amines occasionally, so her daily day-to-day diet at home, she wasn't eating many amines, but she was using her amine threshold for things like going out to dinner, so that when she was out with friends, she could eat higher amine foods. Occasionally she went over a threshold, she gave herself a day to recover, and then she was back to normal again. Most of the time she was eating lactose, using lactose-free dairy, and if there wasn't lactose-free, she just carried a lactase tablet with her, and she took that to manage that lactose sensitivity. She had no concerns. She was feeling fit and healthy, and she was loving food again. And she was so excited to tell me that she could trust her gut again and that she was back in control. Last slide, please. So that's my little story about Lisa and FODMAPs. If you're wanting to learn more about these or find out more about them, you can follow me on social media. So I'm on Instagram at the Gut Health Dietitian. I'm on Facebook. My Facebook page is Everyday Nutrition. And I also run Low FODMAP Australia, which is Australia's largest low FODMAP Facebook group. And I'd love to have you join up there as well. Or you can contact me through my website, which is everydaynutrition.com.au. I work with myself, another 2 dietitians, Marnie and Angela, also collaborate with me, and we see people face-to-face here in Melbourne, although not during COVID, so it's all telehealth at the moment. But we also do virtual consultations around Australia and actually around the world as well. So Lisa actually lives in Florida, so I'm really loving that we've got this technology that we can do these things these days too. So any questions?
Thanks, Joanna, so much for that great presentation. It was really informative. There are a number of questions here which that have come from our audience. I think it's Jack has asked, among your patients, have you observed their FODMAP sensitivity lessens over a longer time frame, or are some on a very restrictive diet for life?
In terms of FODMAPs and food chemicals, when we think about underlying causes of symptoms, food chemicals tend to irritate nerve endings, and they irritate all the nerve endings throughout the body, including in the gut. FODMAPs go into the gut and they create gas which stretches the walls. And if all the nerve endings around the gut are already jumpy and irritated, stretching the walls of the intestines with FODMAPs is almost like poking the bear. I found really commonly that if sensitive to food chemicals, once we remove the food chemicals, those nerve endings relax and calm down, and we can actually introduce FODMAPs into the gut, and the gut, that gas is created, it stretches the intestines, and because the nerve endings are much calmer, they don't respond. And I commonly find that if someone is sensitive to food chemicals, once they actually remove those food chemicals, they are able to then reintroduce those FODMAPs. We know that if it's someone that's just FODMAP sensitive, on the other hand, we know that FODMAPs have got a really big impact on that gut-brain axis and that visceral hypersensitivity. And there are certainly, managing IBS is like having a toolbox. We've got our dietary interventions, but also things like meditation. Gut-directed hypnotherapy has research that shows it's as effective as a FODMAP diet for managing IBS. So managing some of these other things as well can help give us more room to move in terms of FODMAPs. It's very unusual for me to see someone who has to be on a very strict low FODMAP diet forever. Usually we can find some room to move there. Sometimes it might be that we introduce some fiber supplements or a probiotic or iberogast or something like that that helps improve their FODMAP tolerance, or it helps manage the symptoms so you've got more room to move there.
Okay, thank you. Paul has asked, is there any specific advice for someone with colitis and IBS?
There's not a huge amount of research on this, although I know that people who do inflammatory diseases have got a much higher rate of IBS than the standard population. We think that around about 30% of people who have got IBD, when that's in remission, they will still experience IBS type symptoms. And that's when we would see that crossover of IBD and IBS. The research that there is into that has shown that a low FODMAP diet can help when the IBD is in remission. If you're still getting symptoms, FODMAP can help with that. But I would be treating that IBS fairly similar to how I would treat somebody else with IBS. As long as your IBD is in remission, we would treat the IBS. We'd work out what are you sensitive to and what's going to go into our IBS toolbox in terms of managing these symptoms. If the IBD was flaring, then that would be our priority, and we would be managing that IBD first, because that actually does damage the colon.
Thank you, Joanna. Someone from our audience has said that they're sensitive to amines, glutamates, and
Yes.
all FODMAPs. Is there a multivitamin that you could recommend that is low in chemicals?
There are a couple of, so I'm sensitive to amines as well, so my heart goes out to you there. Amines are delicious and I miss them. In terms of a multivitamin that's low FODMAP and low in food chemicals, the ones that there is Synovus, do a multivitamin that doesn't have any amines in it or any FODMAPs in it. It doesn't have any gluten or lactose in it or any dairy at all in it as well. So Synovus one is often a good choice. Blackmore's do a multivitamin that's suitable for people who have food chemical sensitivities and FODMAP sensitivities. And actually the Elevate pregnancy vitamin is another one that is actually a really good multivitamin. It covers all your bases. You don't have to be pregnant to take it, but it's also suitable for low FODMAP and food chemical. So those are usually my first three that I would look at. Obviously in this situation, I can't make personalized recommendations though. So that's
Sure.
general
We
rule
understand.
there.
There seems to be quite a few questions about shampoos and soaps.
Yeah.
So would soaps and shampoos result in gastrointestinal symptoms or mainly skin symptoms such as rashes and eczema, etc.?
It's
There's
a
quite
really
a few
good question.
questions. Yeah.
So perfumes, which we often in soaps and shampoos, perfumes do contain salicylates. Salicylates can enter your bloodstream through your lungs. So when you're shampooing your hair, if you're inhaling those perfumes, the salicylates can still enter your bloodstream, and we can see gastrointestinal symptoms from that. I actually have had one patient who we worked out is sensitive to salicylates, and she worked out that when she was cleaning her house, when she wore a face mask, she was okay. But if she used her cleaning products without a face mask, she would get bloated every single time. And we actually did a structured N=1 study on her with that and found that, yes, she does get bloating from the smells.
Wow. Someone's asked with Lisa, in that year you worked with Lisa, did she use specialized soaps and shampoos?
So usually with soaps and shampoos, if I'm looking at what you use, following the recommend things that don't have perfumes in them or are hypoallergenic. So things like your Cetaphil, your QV, your Dermavines, those really gentle things. I find people who have already got skin rashes and hives are often already using these, and we don't have to change them. But if somebody's not, then that's what we would be changing to, at least temporarily. So not to say they will use that forever, but while we're working out what they're sensitive to.
Okay, and Felicity's asked, sorry, Joanna. Felicity has asked, you go.
I was just going to say that changing the perfumes and soaps and things is another way we can lower salicylate food without restricting food. So some people will choose to carry on with those products so that they can have more variety in their diet. It's kind of that way up.
Okay.
Which is...
Thank you. Sorry, the virtual world, it's tough. We tend to talk over each other. Sorry about that. Felicity has said that if someone has asthma, eczema, and migraines, would you presume that they have some food chemical sensitivities and that this would be worthwhile?
So all of these things can be triggered by other factors as well, which is why I would want someone to see their doctor first and work out if there's an underlying medical condition going on. If there's no medical reason for their symptoms and they suspect that their symptoms do wax and wane or get better or worse related to the food that they eat. So someone might say, I know chocolate triggers my migraines. then I would say that I would normally go down the food chemical path with them to see if that made a difference in their symptoms. The only way to know is really to remove the food chemicals and see if it goes away, and then bring them back to see if we can trigger the symptoms to come back, because it's that ability to trigger them that makes us confident that yes, that is the trigger.
Okay. I think we've got time just for 2 more questions. How long do food chemicals take to trigger the symptoms?
That one's is really, so with food chemicals, we all eat foods that contain them, and our body breaks them down and absorbs them into the body. So say for argument's sake, you're salicylate sensitive and you're eating foods that contain salicylates. By the time the salicylate is in your bloodstream, the body doesn't know what food that came from. It's really related to that overall load. Excuse me. And that's why sometimes we see people say, I can eat a food one week and I'm okay, but I can eat the same food next week and I'm not. It depends your load at the time that you eat the food and how sensitive you are as to how soon you might see symptoms. So if your diet is all low in salicylates and you decide you're going to eat a punnet of strawberries and that's your salicylate food, if that's big enough to push you over, if your diet is low, you may actually get away with those strawberries quite well before you not get any symptoms at all. If last night for dinner you had capsicum and you had tomato sauces and you had herbs and spices and a curry, and then the next day you eat the strawberries, you might get symptoms within half an hour or so. So it can be anything from a build-up several days or a big load all at once, but anything from half an hour to even a week. So when we do the challenges, the salicylate and amine challenges are actually a week long to build up a load over a week. And some people don't react till day 6 or 7.
Okay. So there's a number of questions about your pelvic floor comment. So with someone who has pelvic floor issues, what is the relationship between IBS and the pelvic floor?
Your core muscles and your pelvic floor are holding your abdomen together. Strengthening the pelvic floor has a definite impact on how everything is held together. If someone has what we call, so pelvic floor dysfunction can cause IBS. That's not to say that everybody who has IBS has pelvic floor dysfunction, but it can be a cause of IBS, in which case I'd be looking at seeing a specialist physiotherapist who specializes in pelvic floor, and they can usually do an assessment and give you specific exercises that can help with strengthening certain parts of the pelvic floor, which can then help with managing those symptoms.
Okay, we're almost running out of time. The questions are still coming in. Where can I get more information about food chemicals?
So I use the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital unit. I use their approach. They've got this little handbook that you can buy on their website. There's also, RPA have also got a cookbook as well called Friendly Food Cookbook. But I would always, so with the food chemical diet, there are multiple different ways of approaching it, as you can see. So I would always suggest seeing a specialist dietitian, because we will approach it in different ways for different people. And you've got to get the approach that's right for you. You don't want to get the wrong approach and have it not work, and then you've kind of wasted doing an elimination for no reason at all. So always see a dietitian beforehand who's trained in this diet. A really niche area.
Well, thank you so much, Joanna. That was a really informative presentation. There's so many questions that keep coming up. We could go for another hour, but we're not able to today. Now, we had your slide up before with your contact details. Jared might be able to pop that up again. If people want to contact you, the information is there on the screen for you to follow up, and it'd be great to follow you, I'd say, on your Instagram account and your Facebook account too, Joanna, because I know you've already got a huge following. So thank you, Joanna.